I've done over 100 videos now, and consciousness is a central theme to my channel. And yet I have yet to do a video that explicitly talks about consciousness. So that's what I want to do in this video. I want to give you my definition of consciousness and show you how different it is from mainstream and people who investigate consciousness. And while it may seem very different and unusual, it's actually very old school. It has a very ancient origin that goes back long before my time. So all these experts, when they talk about consciousness, there is a common theme that emerges, and that is that to be conscious, you have to be conscious of something. To be aware, you have to be aware of something. Consciousness always has some type of content. And again, that's very interesting because in the last couple of videos, I've talked about how the thinking mind creates the things in our world, how the thought process itself, and tied in with language, makes us believe in these things out there. Now, sometimes it could be kind of obvious, like a car, but other things like our workplace that we buy into, and social constructs that become very realistic to us, we buy into because that's the nature of the thinking mind. But is it the nature of consciousness? In fact, my definition of consciousness is about as different from mainstream as I think you could get. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. To me, consciousness is what remains after every other thing is removed. So, and again, this isn't really my definition. This is more influenced by my readings in Advaita Vedanta that come right out and say, you know, it's enough to know who you are not. And it's a process of slowly revealing what you are not that you come to see who you actually are. And of course, that's the take on consciousness. So we start by removing mental constructs. We remove mental categories, mental divisions, thoughts, and the things that we think are part of the world, but we realize are actually just part of our thinking process. Now, the interesting thing is when we start doing this process of revealing what are products of the thinking mind versus what are true to consciousness itself, we find that a lot of our problems disappear because they're really thoughts. And so many work problems, again, we treat work like a thing when it really isn't. It's just a collective hallucination of sorts. That's not to say it doesn't have real consequences, but here's the point. It has real consequences in the world of the thinking mind. Once we deconstruct the thinking mind, once we deconstruct the consequences of buying in to the results of the thinking mind, then we find that we're left with something much more innocent, much more Eden-like. And so it's an interesting way to put it. You think about the Garden of Eden. There was no disease, there was no illness, there was no death, and it was only paradise until, of course, we ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And so again, that's a very interesting way to put it, that it's the knowledge, of course, it's the knowledge of good and evil, which in many ways encompasses all knowledge when you think about it. And it's that one taste of knowledge, that one, that leap into, that birth of the thinking mind, which in my view came on about 40 to 70,000 years ago. And once we jumped in, we haven't been able to stop. Now, this isn't to say that when we're thinking, we're necessarily unconscious. It's just that the thinking mind is one form that consciousness can take. And so one way you can think about it is like gold, and we can make gold into some really interesting, attractive jewelry and watches and all these things. But the gold, it still remains as gold. And all these things that we're transforming it into are more illusions, play toys, things for the thinking, to keep the thinking mind occupied. But underneath it all melts down to the same thing. And that's the way, once we remove all the contents of consciousness, we get down to the source, the same underlying consciousness. It's not my consciousness, it's not yours, it's just consciousness. And the reason this is an interesting way to define it is if you look, again, so many scientists are defining consciousness as To be conscious, you have to be aware of something. Well, the definition includes it includes a you are a thing, and it includes all of your problems. And here's an interesting thing about this much older definition, which is to say consciousness is what remains when everything else is taken away. When we look at that definition, again, there's two real benefits to it. First, it's experimentally verifiable. So when you practice becoming aware of the thinking mind, you'll get this experience you can have for yourself that is pure, simple consciousness without the intrusions of the thinking mind, and it's an incredibly peaceful place to be. It's very it's nothing that could be put into words. That's why you should check it out and experience it for yourself. But the cool thing about the experience is you can show absolutely that consciousness does not need content. So you can get this experience of consciousness aware of nothing other than its own existence. And so their consciousness is not an subject-object separation. Its consciousness is its own awareness of itself. And so there's nothing in the content of consciousness. Now, the practical side of that is that all of your problems, all of you, disappear in all this. And because you realize, once you turn down a thinking mind, you are a thought. Your problems are thinking problems most of the time. It's interesting to see where we can push this, to see where the line is drawn, how many problems are real and how many are a product of the thinking mind. But from my perspective, the vast majority of these problems stem from the thinking mind. So I'll just leave you with one little practice so you may realize that you're in this state more than you think you are. So Susan Blackmore, who is one of these very well-known consciousness researchers, she has her students do an exercise. Now, she doesn't think you're conscious as much as you would think you're conscious. So she has her students write little reminders all over the place. Was I conscious? And the idea is like, you may catch yourself not being conscious. Well, again, I don't buy into any of that. I think you're conscious all the time. I don't think consciousness is something that can be turned off. But the thinking mind is something that comes and goes. And so what I have is a slight variation on this, just putting little reminders. Was I thinking? Was I thinking a moment ago? You might catch yourself and realize that you're not thinking as much as you think you're thinking. So the thinking mind has a fascinating kind of paradox to it where, like right now, I'm in the mode of the thinking mind. So if I go to assess whether or not I've been thinking I'm just assuming that I've been thinking this whole time. But you'll catch yourself if you do this and you put these reminders around, and you'll catch states where you absolutely are having experiences without an experiencer. It's pure experience without any content. There's no content. You're not smelling a flower and the smell is the content. Because to have that, you need a you. And so there's no experiencer behind the experience. It's just pure experience. And it's not necessarily contrasted and labeled with all the doings of the thinking mind. It's just a very nice, is-like experience that is difficult to put into words. So that's my definition of consciousness. Consciousness is what is left when everything else is removed. Now, that doesn't mean science will not play a role. I think science will play an enormous, has a huge role to play in all this. It's like science is like that garbage truck that's going to pull back and take all the junk that isn't. It's things masquerading as consciousness and things leading us down this believing that we're really awake and we're really aware when we're really just hypnotized by the thinking mind, which is more like a dream state. And you can realize this the more experiences you have of consciousness without content.